I didn't notice it right away. Or maybe that's not true. Maybe I noticed something small and just didn't give it a name yet. Because it didn't feel important at first. It felt like one of those little things that happens in conversations. The kind of thing you don't hold on to. You just let it pass. I remember the first time it stood out. We were sitting in a small restaurant, one of those quiet places with soft lighting where conversations feel a little slower. She was telling me about someone from work, not even someone close to her, just a coworker. And she went into detail. The kind of detail that makes you realize someone's been paying attention. What he said in a meeting, the exact way he said it, how he reacted afterward, even a small thing about how he stirred his coffee when he was nervous. I remember smiling while she talked, listening, nodding, but somewhere in the middle of it, a small thought appeared. Just a passing one. You remember all of this? It wasn't jealousy. Not exactly. It was more like curiosity about what people choose to hold on to. I didn't say anything about it. Of course I didn't. It didn't feel like something you bring up. So I let it go, and the night continued the way nights usually did back then. Easy, comfortable. The kind of comfortable that makes you think everything is working the way it should. Back then, things felt open. We talked about everything. Or at least it felt like we did. Long conversations that didn't really have a destination. We'd start with something small and somehow end up somewhere deeper. Sometimes I'd tell her stories about things I hadn't thought about in years. Moments from childhood, random memories, things that didn't seem important until I said them out loud. And she listened. At least, I thought she did. Actually, no, she did listen. I don't think I'm rewriting that part. She was there, present, asking questions, reacting in a way that made me feel understood. And I remember thinking at the time, this feels rare. That kind of attention, the feeling that someone is actually interested in the way your mind works. Not just the facts of your life, but how you remember things. Why certain moments stayed with you. Those early months felt like that a lot. Like we were slowly mapping each other out. Learning small details. Not just the obvious ones. The subtle ones. The kind you only notice when you're really paying attention. I used to watch her when she was listening. There was this slight pause she had before responding. Like she was considering what you said instead of just reacting. And I liked that. It made conversations feel real. Not automatic. But somewhere along the way, that feeling shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing ever did with us. It was always quieter than that. I think the second time I noticed it was a few months later. We were walking through a park. It was late afternoon. That kind of soft light where everything looks a little warmer than it actually is. And I was telling her a story. Something small. About a moment from my childhood. I don't even remember exactly what the story was now. Which is strange. Because I remember the feeling of telling it more than the story itself. I remember finishing it. Looking over at her. And there was a pause. Not a thoughtful pause. Just a pause. Then she smiled. Said something like, "That's cute." And then, the conversation moved on. Naturally. Like nothing was missing. And again, it didn't feel like a problem. It just felt light. Like the story didn't really land anywhere. I didn't think about it much after that. Not consciously. But I think something in me registered it. Quietly. Because after that, I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Not intentionally. Just noticing. The way she told stories about other people. The level of detail. The way she remembered things. Names. Moments. Exact phrases. She could recall entire conversations she had with friends. Weeks later. Sometimes months. The tone. The context. Even how someone reacted in a small moment. And again, I didn't feel upset about it. Not directly. I just found it interesting. What we choose to remember says something about what matters to us. At least, that's what I started thinking. And I didn't know what it meant that she remembered those things. But I noticed. And once you start noticing something like that, it's hard to stop. There was one night that stayed with me longer than the others. We were sitting on the couch. The same couch we always sat on. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching it. She was talking about a friend of hers. Something that happened between them a few years back. And she told the story in a way that felt detailed. Not just the event, but the feeling of it. What her friend had said. How she responded. The way it changed things between them for a while. And I remember listening to it and feeling something shift slightly. Because I had told her something similar once. Not the same story, but something that mattered to me. And for a moment, I tried to remember. If she had ever brought it up again. If she remembered it the same way. And I realized. I didn't think she did. That realization didn't hit all at once. It was more like something settling into place. Quietly. like a piece of a puzzle you didn't realize you were putting together. I didn't confront it. I didn't even fully understand it yet, but it stayed in my mind, in the background. And I think that's when the shift really began. Not in the relationship itself, but in the way I experienced it. Because once you start wondering if someone remembers you the same way you remember them, you start paying attention to different things. You listen differently. You notice what gets repeated, what gets forgotten, what gets brought up again, and what never comes back. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Memory is selective. Everyone holds on to different things. That's normal. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. It wasn't just one or two moments. It was consistent. She remembered stories about other people, with detail, with clarity, with a kind of emotional precision. But when it came to things I had shared, they didn't seem to stay the same way. Not gone completely, just lighter, less anchored. There was one specific moment that made it impossible to brush aside anymore. We were out with a group of her friends, sitting around a table, everyone talking over each other a little, laughing, sharing stories. And at one point, she brought up something about one of her friends, a story from years ago, and she told it with so much detail that everyone at the table reacted like they were reliving it with her. And I sat there listening, watching, and I had this strange thought. You remember this so clearly. And almost immediately after that thought, another one followed. Do you remember my stories like that? I didn't know the answer, but something in me already suspected it. Later that night, when we got home, I found myself thinking about it again. Not obsessively, just circling back to it. The way thoughts do when they're trying to understand something. And I started replaying moments in my head, conversations we had, things I had shared, and I realized something subtle but clear. She rarely brought those things up again. Not the way she did with others. Not with the same detail. Not with the same sense of importance. And that's when the question finally formed fully. Not just a passing thought. A real one. Do I matter in the same way in her memory? That question stayed with me. For days. Maybe longer. And I didn't know what to do with it. Because it wasn't a clear problem. There was no argument. No moment where something broke. Just a quiet observation. And quiet observations are the hardest ones to address. Because you can't point to them easily. You can't say, this is what's wrong. It's more like a feeling that slowly becomes clearer the more you sit with it. I didn't want to overthink it. I told myself that. Multiple times. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. Maybe I'm just paying too much attention. But the thing about paying attention is, once you start, it's hard to go back to not seeing. And I kept noticing. Small things. Conversations where she would forget a detail I had mentioned before. Moments where I would reference something I told her, and she would pause, trying to recall it, not immediately recognizing it. And again, none of this caused conflict. We didn't argue about it. I didn't bring it up. Because how do you say something like that without it sounding strange? I feel like you don't remember me the same way you remember other people. It sounds abstract, hard to explain. So I stayed quiet and just observed. And the more I observed, the more something became clear. It wasn't about memory in a literal sense. It wasn't that she forgot everything. It was the weight of what she remembered. Some stories stayed vivid, detailed, alive. Others didn't. And I started to feel like mine belonged in the second category. Not gone, just lighter, less defined. And that realization didn't hurt in a dramatic way. It wasn't sharp. It was slow, like something settling deeper over time. I think that's when I started changing in small ways. Without really meaning to. I shared less. Not consciously at first. Just naturally. Because if something doesn't seem to stay, you begin to wonder if it's worth placing there again. That's not resentment. It's something quieter. More like hesitation. And hesitation changes the way you show up in a relationship. You become slightly more reserved. Slightly more selective. Not because you want to pull away. Because something in you is trying to protect itself from feeling unremembered. I didn't think of it that way at the time. But looking back now, that's what it was. A slow shift. From openness to caution. From sharing freely to measuring what you share. And the relationship didn't change all at once because of it. Everything still looked the same on the surface. We still talked. Still spent time together. Still moved through our routines. But something underneath had started to shift. Quietly. And I don't think either of us fully understood it yet. Not then. But I could feel it. In the way I listened to her. In the way I spoke. In the small pauses before I shared something personal. Like I was asking myself, will this matter? Will this stay? Or will it just pass through like the others? And I didn't have an answer. Not a clear one. Just a growing sense that something about the way we held each other's stories wasn't the same. And I didn't know what that meant yet. But I knew it mattered, even if I couldn't explain why. And that was the beginning of something I wouldn't fully understand until much later. Because sometimes, the first sign of distance isn't silence. It's realizing that your stories don't live in someone else's memory the way theirs live in yours. And once you notice that, you start listening for it everywhere. Even in moments that feel completely normal on the surface. Even in the quiet spaces between conversations. Even in the way someone says, "I don't remember you telling me that," and smiles like it's nothing. Like it's just a small thing. But something in you pauses. Because it didn't feel small when you said it the first time. And now, it feels like it disappeared. And you don't say anything about it. You just nod. Maybe repeat the story. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you just let it go. And that's how it starts. Not with a fight. Not with distance you can measure. Just with small moments. Where something you thought mattered doesn't seem to stay. Not because I was keeping score. I kept telling myself that. But it wasn't about numbers. It was about something harder to explain. The feeling of placing something somewhere. And realizing it didn't stay. After a while, I stopped bringing things back up. Not intentionally. It just felt unnecessary. Like repeating something that had already passed through once without leaving much behind. And that changed the way I spoke without me realizing it right away. I started choosing smaller things to share. Safer things. Things that didn't require attention to feel complete. Because when something important doesn't seem to stay, you start protecting it. Even from the person you're closest to. I think that was the part that shifted the most. Not her behavior. Mine. Because I was still there. Still listening. Still reacting. Still part of the relationship in every visible way. But internally, something had become more careful. More measured. And I didn't notice how much that mattered until one evening. We were sitting at the table. Dinner was already finished. Plates pushed slightly to the side. That quiet moment where neither person is in a hurry to get up yet. She was talking about something again. A friend. A situation. And the way she told it, it was the same as before. Detailed. Specific. Alive. And I remember watching her as she spoke. Not just listening. Watching. The way she recalled things. The way certain moments stayed sharp in her memory. And I had this thought. Not emotional. Just clear. You hold on to them differently. I didn't feel hurt in that moment. I felt outside of something. Like I was observing a pattern that no longer needed explanation. And I think that's when the realization started to shift from a question into something closer to an answer. It wasn't that she didn't care. I don't think that's true. She did. In her way. But the way she held people in her mind. The way she remembered them. The weight she gave to their stories. Wasn't the same for me. And once that became clear, something else followed. I started remembering my own stories differently. Not the stories themselves, but the way I valued sharing them. Because if something doesn't live anywhere after you say it, it starts to feel lighter, less necessary. Like speaking it out loud doesn't change anything. There was one night that made that feeling impossible to ignore. We were lying in bed, lights off, the room quiet, and I mentioned something small, about a moment from my childhood. Not a big story, just one of those things that comes up naturally when you're talking without thinking too much. And she was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I don't think you've ever told me that before." And I paused. Because I had. I was sure of it. Not recently. But I had told her. At some point. And I remember that moment when I told it the first time. Not clearly. But enough to know it wasn't new. And I had this strange feeling. Not frustration. Not even disappointment. Just confirmation. Like something I had been quietly noticing had just been said out loud in a different way. I didn't correct her. I didn't say, "No, I told you this before." Because suddenly, it didn't feel important to prove that. I just said, "Maybe I didn't," and let it go. And that moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Because it wasn't about the story. It was about what it represented. The way things passed through. The way they didn't anchor. The way they didn't become part of something shared. After that, something in me shifted again. Not dramatically. Just enough. I stopped expecting her to remember. And when you stop expecting something, you stop noticing when it doesn't happen. That's the strange part. It becomes normal, the same way everything else had. And that normalization, it changes the relationship in a quiet way. Because expectation is part of connection. You expect to be heard, to be remembered, to exist in someone else's mind the way they exist in yours. And when that expectation fades, so does something else. Presence. Not physical presence. Something deeper. The The sense that you are held, not just in the moment, but beyond it, in memory, in thought, in the way someone carries you with them when you're not there. And I think that's when I started feeling something I couldn't name at first. Not distance. Not exactly. More like lightness. But not in a good way. Like I wasn't taking up much space anymore. Even when I was right there. We still talked. Still spent time together. Still moved through our days. But I felt less defined. In her world. And I don't think she noticed that. Why would she? From her perspective, everything was still working. We weren't fighting. We weren't pulling away. We were just continuing. And continuation can hide a lot of things. It can make something look stable even when something underneath is changing. I remember a moment during a conversation with her friends. We were all sitting together, talking, laughing, and she brought up another story. About someone else. Something detailed again. Something that had clearly stayed with her. And I found myself thinking, if I disappeared from her life tomorrow, how much of me would stay in her memory? Not in a dramatic way. Just honestly. What would remain? What would she recall? What stories would she tell about me? And I didn't have an answer. Not one that felt certain. And that uncertainty, it settled into something quiet. Because I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. I remembered her in detail. The way she spoke. The way she reacted to certain things. The stories she told. The moments she paused. But I didn't feel the same certainty in the other direction. And that imbalance, it doesn't show up loudly. It doesn't create conflict. It just sits there. Under everything. And over time, it changes how you feel inside the relationship. Not what you do. How you exist in it. I think that's when I started to feel something like fading. Not leaving. Just becoming less present. Even while being there. And I didn't know what to do with that feeling. Because there was nothing to fix. Nothing to confront. Nothing that could be pointed at and named clearly. Just a quiet realization that the way we held each other wasn't the same. And maybe it had never been. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it yet. Or maybe it had changed slowly. The way most things do. Without a clear moment. Without a clear reason. Just over time. And once that thought settled in, I stopped trying to define it. Stopped trying to understand exactly why. Because sometimes, understanding doesn't change anything. It just makes something clearer. And clarity doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it just removes the question. And leaves you with something you can't ignore anymore. That quiet awareness. That you don't live in someone else's memory the way they live in yours. And once you feel that clearly enough, something inside you adjusts. Not loudly. Just enough to know. You're there. But not in the same way. And maybe you never were. And after that, I think I became quieter in a different way. Not the kind of quiet you can notice from the outside. I still talked. Still responded. Still laughed when something was funny. If someone looked at us, nothing would have seemed different. But inside, something had shifted in how much of myself I was offering. Because once you feel like parts of you don't stay anywhere, you stop placing them down so easily. It's not a decision you make. It just happens. Like your mind adjusting to something it finally understands. I remember one afternoon very clearly. It wasn't an important day. Nothing significant had happened. I had gone through work, finished everything I needed to do, and came home feeling normal. Not tired. Not stressed. Just present. And I had this moment where I thought, I want to tell her about today. Not because anything special happened. Just because it was mine. That feeling used to be enough. The idea that something mattered simply because you experienced it. But when I got home, she was already there. Sitting on the couch. Phone in her hand. The same soft light in the room. And I stood there for a second, just watching her. Not in a dramatic way. Just noticing. And that thought came again. Not as strong this time. More familiar. Would this stay with her? And I realized I didn't know anymore. Not in the way I used to. So instead of telling her about my day, I said something simple. Something surface level. Work was fine. And she nodded. Asked a small follow-up question. I answered. And that was it. And it wasn't a bad moment. It just ended quickly. Like most of our conversations did now. Contained. Complete. But not expanding. And as I sat down next to her, I noticed something else. I didn't feel like I had left anything unsaid. Not because I had shared everything. Because I had already decided not to. And that realization stayed with me longer than I expected. Because it wasn't about her response. It was about my expectation of it. I had already adjusted. Already accepted something quietly. And once you accept something like that, you stop reaching in the same way. I think that's when the distance became something internal. Not between us physically. Between how I felt and what I expressed. I started living more of my experiences privately, not in a secretive way, just internally, like I no longer needed them to be witnessed in order to feel complete. And that sounds like independence, but it didn't feel like that. It felt more like withdrawal, a gentle one, almost invisible. There was another moment, small again, but clear. We were in the car, driving somewhere I can't even remember now, and the radio was playing quietly. She was looking out the window. I was focused on the road, and there was this stretch of silence. Not uncomfortable, just there. And I had this impulse to ask her something. One of those questions we used to ask each other. Not about plans, not about work. Something open, something that didn't have a predictable answer. But I stopped myself. Not because I didn't want to ask, because I already felt like I knew how it would go. Not the exact words, just the shape of it. And that was enough to quiet the impulse. And I remember thinking, when did I stop expecting something new? That question stayed with me. Because expectation shapes behavior. If you expect discovery, you reach for it. If you expect repetition, you don't. And somewhere along the way, I had stopped expecting discovery. Not consciously, just slowly. And that realization felt heavier than the others. Because it wasn't about her anymore. It was about me. About how I had changed inside the relationship. I had become more contained, more self-sufficient emotionally. And again, that sounds like growth. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something closing slightly. Like a door that used to stay open without effort, now needing a reason to be opened again. And most of the time, there wasn't a reason strong enough. I think people imagine distance as something visible. Less time together, less talking, more arguments. But this kind of distance, it's quieter than that. It happens inside. While everything on the outside still looks the same. We still had routines, still shared space, still cared about each other. But the way I existed within that space had changed. I wasn't placing as much of myself into it anymore. Not because I didn't want to, because I no longer felt like it would stay. And I think that's when I started noticing something else. The relationship didn't need as much from me anymore. Not emotionally. It functioned without depth, without constant sharing, without curiosity. And once a relationship reaches that point, you start to question something you hadn't before. What part of me is actually here? Not physically, something else. The part that used to reach, to ask, to share, to wonder. I still had that part. I could feel it, but I wasn't using it in the relationship anymore. And that created a strange kind of disconnect. Because I wasn't empty. I just wasn't bringing that part forward. And over time, that changes how you feel. Not about the other person, about yourself. There was a night when everything felt especially clear. Nothing dramatic happened. That's the pattern, I guess. We were sitting in the living room again. The same quiet, the same light. She was watching something on her phone. I was sitting next to her, not doing anything, just there. And I remember looking around the room, at the space we had built together, the routines, the objects, everything that represented the relationship from the outside. And then I looked at her, and I had a thought that felt final in a way. Not final like an ending, final like something had settled. I'm not really here the way I used to be. And I didn't mean physically. I meant emotionally. The version of me that used to be curious, open, constantly reaching for connection, was still there, but not in this space anymore. And that realization didn't come with sadness right away. It came with clarity, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't ask for attention. It just sits there, and you understand it, without needing to explain it out loud. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't bring it up. There was nothing to bring up. Because nothing was wrong in a way that could be fixed with a conversation. And maybe that's the hardest kind of change to face. The kind that doesn't give you something to respond to. It just exists. And you adjust to it. Slowly, quietly. Until one day, you realize you've already changed. And you don't remember exactly when it happened. Only that it did. And I think that's where we were at that point. Not broken. Not distant in any visible way. Just different. In a way that didn't need to be said. And maybe that's why it lasted as long as it did after that. Because nothing forced us to look at it directly. We just kept moving through the same patterns, the same routines, the same quiet evenings. And somewhere inside all of that, something had already shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, just enough. And once something shifts like that, it doesn't always move back. Sometimes it just stays there, unspoken, underneath everything. And you learn how to exist around it, without ever really naming it out loud. And eventually, something did change. Not suddenly, not in a way you could point to and say, that was the moment. It was more like a slow shift in direction, almost unnoticeable at first, until one day you realize you're no longer walking the same path. I don't remember the exact day it ended. That's probably the most honest thing I can say. There wasn't a conversation where everything was laid out clearly. No moment where we sat down and said, "This isn't working anymore." If anything, it felt like we both already knew. And neither of us needed to say it out loud, because saying it would have made it heavier, more real than it needed to be. Instead, things just started loosening. She stayed later at work more often. I didn't ask about it as much. Not because I didn't care, because it didn't feel like something I was part of anymore. We still talked, still texted, still moved through the same routines. But something about those routines felt optional now, like they were habits we were continuing out of familiarity, not necessity. There was one evening that stands out, not because anything dramatic happened, because of how ordinary it was. I came home a little later than usual. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, just still. Her shoes were by the door, her jacket on the chair, but she wasn't in the living room. I found her in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at her phone. She looked up when I walked in, gave me a small smile, the same kind of smile she had given me 100 times before. And for a second, everything looked normal. I asked how her day was. She told me. I listened, nodded, said something supportive, and then the conversation ended, just like it always did. And I remember standing there, in that quiet room, thinking something that didn't feel surprising anymore. We're just continuing something that already ended. Not in reality. Not yet. But somewhere underneath everything. It had already reached its final shape, and we were just living inside it. That night we ate dinner together, watched something, went to bed. Nothing unusual, and I think that's what made it clear. There was no moment left that could change anything. No conversation that would suddenly open something new between us. No question that would lead somewhere unexpected. Everything had already been explored, and once something feels fully explored, there's a kind of stillness that follows. A quiet acceptance. I don't remember when I stopped thinking about fixing it. At some point, that thought just disappeared. Not because I gave up, because there was nothing to fix in a traditional sense. Nothing broken, just something that had slowly finished becoming what it was. A few days later, we had a conversation. Not a big one, not emotional, just honest. She was standing in the kitchen. I was leaning against the counter, and she said something simple. "I think things feel different." That was it. No accusations, no explanation, just that. And I nodded, because there was nothing else to do. I could have asked what she meant, but I already knew, in the same way I had known everything else for a while now. So I said, "Yeah, I think so too." And we stood there for a moment, not looking at each other, not avoiding each other either, just standing in that shared understanding. And what surprised me most about that moment was how calm it felt. No panic, no sadness rushing in all at once. Just a quiet recognition, like finally naming something that had been present for a long time. We didn't decide anything right then. We didn't need to, because the decision had already been happening. Slowly, over months. In all the moments we didn't notice. In all the conversations that didn't expand. In all the silences that felt normal. That night we went to bed like we always did. No final words. No long talk. Just the same routine. But something about it felt lighter. Not better. Just clearer. Over the next few weeks, things continued in that same quiet way. We spent less time together. Without discussing it. We made separate plans more often. Without needing to explain why. And eventually, she packed some of her things. Not everything at once. Just enough. And I remember watching her move around the apartment. Folding clothes. Putting things into a bag. Calm. Focused. Not emotional in an obvious way. And I didn't stop her. I didn't ask her to stay. Because something inside me already understood. This wasn't something you could hold on to by trying harder. It had already moved past that point. When she left that day, there wasn't a long goodbye. She stood by the door, looked at me, said, "I'll text you." And I said, "Okay." And that was it. The door closed, and the apartment became quiet again. A different kind of quiet. Not unfamiliar. Just empty in a way it hadn't been before. I stood there for a while, not moving. Not thinking anything specific. Just there. And what I felt wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a sharp kind of pain. It wasn't relief either. It was something in between. A quiet acknowledgement. Like watching something fade completely after noticing it slowly disappear for a long time. In the weeks after that, life continued. Work. Routines. Evenings. The same structure as before, but without her. And strangely, it didn't feel as different as I thought it would. Not because she didn't matter. Because the emotional shift had already happened before she left. That's the part one think about sometimes. How the relationship didn't end when we separated. It ended quietly, long before that. In all the moments where curiosity faded, where conversations stopped expanding, where we stopped discovering each other. What we did at the end was just catching up to something that had already been true. Now, sometimes at night, when everything is quiet again, I think about those early days. The conversations that didn't have an endpoint. The questions that opened new directions. The feeling that there was always something more to understand. And I try to remember exactly when that feeling disappeared. But I can't. Because it didn't disappear all at once. It just faded. One predictable moment at a time. Until there was nothing left to discover. And maybe that's the part that stays with me the most. Not the ending. Not the separation. But the quiet way something meaningful can become familiar. And then predictable. And then still. Without anyone doing anything wrong. Sometimes I wonder if we could have changed it. If we had noticed it earlier. If we had asked more questions. If we had tried to stay curious. But those thoughts don't go very far. Because the truth is, we didn't. We just continued. Until continuing wasn't enough anymore. And now, when I think about her, I don't think about one specific moment. I think about a pattern. A slow shift. A quiet ending that didn't need a final scene. Just a realization that we had already reached the end, long before we said goodbye.